Okay, so we're going to solve a quadratic equation using the square root property. The square root property is just simply the fact that when you square root something, it has to be both positive and negative, okay? Because when you square it, a negative times a negative is a positive, and a positive times a positive is also a positive. All right, so I'm just verbally mentioning that. Well, let's look at it in terms of this equation. So 3v squared minus 120. Our first goal here is to move constants or constant to opposite side of the variable. Okay, so I can see that the variable, another way to say this is just simply to say isolate the variable, right? So if I want to isolate the variable, then I'm going to need to do the opposite of this number right here. That number is negative 120. The opposite of negative 120 is positive 120. But what I do to one side, I must also do to the other. So what I'm going to get here is 0 plus 120 is 120, and that's going to equal 3v squared. Okay? Now, I still want to isolate the variable. In order to isolate this variable, I know that these are multiplied together. 3v squared is 3 times v squared. Because these are multiplied together, in order to separate them, I must do a division problem by dividing by 3 on both sides to knock out the coefficient. So once you hit this stage, you are going to divide both sides by the variable's coefficient. Okay? And again, 3 is the coefficient. It's the thing that sits in front of the variable. So dividing both sides by that, I'm going to get 40 equals v squared. Now at this point, I got to get rid of the squared. So whenever you need to get rid of a square, you have to square root. So square roots are the opposite of squared numbers. Okay? So, because you know that, we are now going to square root this and square root this. By the way, this goes back to some of the problems we've looked at before, where we have the when we have v squared square root is really the same as v squared to the 1/2. I have a power to a power, so it means I'm going to have v times 2 times 1 over 2, which is v 2 over 2, which is simply equal to v. So we know that this is going to become v, and this is now the square root of 40. Now, the square root of 40 is not exact, so what we need to do is we need to find out what the decimal version of that is, and the only way to really do that is going to be to have a calculator on hand. So give me a minute here. Okay, so the square root of 40 is actually 6.32 4, 5, dot, 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 and it goes on forever, right? So I'm going to make this to the thousandth right here. And because I look next door and that number's greater, that 4 has to increase to 5. So my final result is actually going to be 6.325. But because it's square rooted, using the square root property, I know I have to have a positive and negative version of this. So what I'd have is plus 6.325 and minus 6.325. And those are my answers.